Most of the car community would agree that the 2000s were the last hurrah of crazy, borderline unfeasible gasoline-powered creations. A lot of manufacturers released their greatest hits during the 2000s, a lot of them being the last of their kind. The E60 BMW M5 with its V10, the Porsche Carrera GT, the E92 M3, and some other minor stuff like the last Ford Explorer generation to offer a V8. However, due to the relatively lax regulations in the 2000s, there was one less talked about trend in the industry that can be summarized with a famous quote from Jurassic Park. They were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should. But oftentimes they could, and it worked surprisingly well. Today on Core Motive, a forgotten automotive subset of the 2000s. V6 powered compact hatchbacks. Let's dive right in. So this video is kind of a sequel to a different video I made in 2021 called Volkswagen's 2000s Insanity, in which I talked about VW losing its collective marbles in the 2000s and installing massive heavy engines into pretty much all of their vehicles. One perfect example of this, which also ties into this video, is all of the V6 powered VW Golfs et al. Everyone knows the Golf R32, but that wasn't the only Golf with 6 cylinders. The Mark III and Mark IV both offered the VR6 engine as a regular part of the lineup. The Golf VR6 Synchro for the Mark III and the Golf V6 4Motion for the Mark IV. It wasn't until the Mark IV when VW would use the VR6 engine to leverage a top-of-the-line performance variant to sit above the GTI, which in itself had become an appearance package by the Mark III and the Mark IV. It was up to the buyer to choose the correct engine to make it a proper GTI. The Mark IV Golf R32 debuted in 2003, powered by a 3.2-liter VR6 developing 240 horsepower and 320 Nm of torque. Yes, this was a lot back in that day, and the Mark IV was able to put the power down thanks to its 4Motion all-wheel drive system. It was also the first production car to offer a dual-clutch automatic transmission, known as the DSG. These were the days before the DSG had developed a serious case of flatulence, however. The Mark IV was followed up by the Mark V in 2005, which was the same in many ways. It did have a little more power, and it was obviously based on the Mark V Golf platform. Volkswagen's oddball VR6 engine didn't only find a home in performance-focused versions of the VW Golf, however. Both of these cars are pretty rare and expensive nowadays, especially the Mark IV, which is already becoming a classic car as reflected in the prices. Obviously, it reached stuff you might expect, like the original Audi TT, which also got the DSG transmission, and eventually the Porsche Cayenne. However, we get now to the stranger stuff. The first generation Seat Leon, in itself based on the Mark IV Golf, was also available with the smaller 2.8-liter VR6. Yes, really. As you might imagine, this version is quite rare. VW's engineers also thought it was a good idea to shoehorn the VR6 under the hood of the Beetle to create the super limited Beetle RSI, complete with a crazy body kit and a stripped out interior. Eventually, the Audi A3 would also go on to receive the VR6 for the car's second generation, and the second generation of the Audi TT was the last one to offer the VR6. Now, at this point, I'm sure you're all aware of these cars and their use of 6-cylinder engines. However, believe it or not, they weren't the only hatchbacks in the 2000s to have V6 power. Other European automakers decided to jump on the bandwagon too. One of the more well-known examples of this is the legendary Renault Clio V6. The story of this car's development and construction is worthy of its own separate video, so let me know if that's something you'd like to see. Anyways, imagine taking a Renault Clio, a favorite among beginner drivers and the elderly, taking out the rear seats and replacing them with a 2.9-liter V6 engine, then giving it a crazy wide-body rear-wheel drive and a manual transmission. That resulted in the Clio V6, also known by its official name, the Clio V6 Renault Sport. The Phase 2 version of this car, released in 2003, is the more well-known of the two versions. As featured in Need for Speed Most Wanted and Carbon, the Clio V6 Phase 2 bumped horsepower up to 255, making it the most powerful hot hatchback in the world at the time. The sprint to 100 km per hour took 5.9 seconds, while it maxed out at 246 km per hour. For a small car with a V6 engine, that might not seem all that fast, but that's until you remember that the Clio V6 was about a third of a ton heavier than the standard Clio, with which it shared a few components. All of those horses went to the rear wheels through a 6-speed manual transmission. An homage to the rally-conquering Renault 5 Turbo family of the 1980s, the Clio V6, as you might imagine, didn't sell in huge numbers. Not many people understood the appeal of a small grocery getter with a V6 taking the place of said groceries. As a result, Clio V6 sales numbers are tiny, and these days, a solid example can fetch lots of money. So how about something a little more in the realms of reality, and something from an automaker that makes a lot of enthusiasts release a little bit of spunk when they hear its name? That's right, I'm talking about Alfa Romeo. To combat the new super hatch revolution of the 2000s started by the likes of the Mark I Ford Focus RS and Mark IV Golf R32, Alfa struck back with one of its most infamous performance cars, the 147 GTA. Like the Golf R32, the 147 GTA was powered by a V6 engine, specifically the 3.2-liter Busso V6, which causes Alfa enthusiasts to release a little additional spunk when they hear both its name and the sound it makes, and rightfully so. Anyways, the 147 GTA had the aforementioned Ford and VW licked when it came to raw horsepower, but Alfa, in their infinite wisdom, forgot to give it the necessary hardware to handle the oomph, and they kept it front-wheel drive. Sure, it had double wishbones at the front and McPherson struts in the rear, and it sat on wider tires than the standard 147, but no limited slip differential, or any kind of more involved differential setup for that matter. As a result, in stock form, the 147 GTA was pretty much 1.3 tons of code brown. Fortunately, plenty of aftermarket remedies exist nowadays, and due to its rarity and exclusivity, plus the simple fact that it's an Alfa Romeo, the 147 GTA is the stuff of legend in the Alfa community. Believe it or not, that's not all. BMW also joined in on the action in the 2000s with the original 1 Series. After the 3 Series Compact was booed off stage twice, BMW decided the only way they're going to steal sales from the all-conquering VW Golf is by designing a proper 5-door hatchback. The resulting E87 1 Series, not to be a killjoy or anything, but I see the original 1 Series as the embodiment of this meme. This is easily one of the weakest cars of the Bengal era. I drove one for a bit, and while the power was decent, the visibility for a hatchback car was abysmal. Anyway, despite this being a small 5-door hatchback, BMW didn't want their sheer driving pleasure, registered trademark, to suffer, so they kept it rear-wheel drive. This meant that the 1 Series handled like a proper BMW in the corners. Maybe, but what it actually meant was the car could spin out at high speeds and it was smaller inside than the one half of a magic sawbox. Alright, you're not here to listen to me whine about the 1 Series, so let's move on. Naturally, with the 1 Series being a rear-wheel drive vehicle, the engines had to be mounted longitudinally rather than transversely like in most other hatchbacks. This meant that BMW could stick their 6-cylinder engines under the hood of the smallest model, and so they did. Unfortunately, the top-of-the-line 135i was coupe only. The hatchback version stopped at the 130i. Still, with either 255 or 261 horsepower from its 3-liter N52 6-cylinder, the 130i had the right ingredients to stick it to the other V6 hatchbacks of its day. While also being much easier to drift, which I guess makes it more fun? Interestingly, for the second generation 1 Series, BMW started offering the newly renamed M135i, later the M140i, in hatchback form as well. And finally, we arrive at the final car, and the one that was a direct inspiration for this video. Back in the 2000s, Toyota decided to rename its global Corolla lineup in most markets to Auris. Auris translates to ear in Latin, by the way. Strange move. Anyways, the Auris, despite carrying that oddball name, was just a Corolla. That meant an inoffensive, practical hatchback that will probably outlive both your parents and your grandparents. In Europe and basically everywhere else, the Auris was offered with your standard commuter spec 4-cylinder engines. Japan, meanwhile, got something rather special. This is the Toyota Blade Master G. Kinda sounds like an Xbox gamer tag from 2009. On the face of it, other than the significantly different front and rear end styling, the Blade Master G is just an Auris, right? Well, yes, but actually, no. You pop the hood and BAM! 3.5-liter V6, motherfucker! Yes, really. This is a Corolla with the same 2GR FE engine as the Camry, and more notably the Lotus Evora and the Miura. In the Blade Master G, it made 280 horsepower, and all of that went to the front wheels through, unfortunately, a 6-speed automatic transmission. No manual was ever offered, or all-wheel drive for that matter. The Blade Master G was a more luxurious version of the Blade in and of itself, and as you'd imagine, the Master G was quite the rare example. Japan as a whole isn't really into big cars with massive engines, so the Master G didn't do all that well, selling just over 3,000 units throughout the 2000s, some of those coming into the western part of the world over time. It's completely legal to import to the UK and Canada, for example, and if you live in the EU, you could also get one technically. And that's the V6 powered hatchback influx of the 2000s. Unfortunately, with the ever so stringent emissions regulations, I am so tired of saying that, it's highly unlikely we will ever see anything like this again. Still, this is just further proof that the 2000s will remain one of the very best eras for cars. And that's going to be about it for this video, everybody. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, be sure to hit like and subscribe to the channel. Also follow me on Twitter, there will be a link in the description, and I will see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.